Hello, gamers! My name is Kyarth, and we are once again taking a look at Commander metagame stats. If you've watched the first video I put out on this channel, then firstly, sorry about that, but secondly, you would know that I'd spend a good deal of time collecting CEDH data, CEDH meaning Competitive Commander. Last time I was talking about some CEDH tier lists I had assembled for 2024, and at the start of the month, I updated all of those lists, so today we will be covering those updates. However, since that first video was a bit messily written, I'm going to be quickly going over some of the things from that in a much more concise and hopefully more easy to understand manner, so don't worry about needing to watch that one first to understand this video. Without further ado though, let's start talking about these newly updated competitive tier lists. So, first and foremost, the place I get my data from is mtgdex.net, which is essentially a metagame database for the various Magic the Gathering formats. Usually people use it for 1v1 formats, since those tend to be, the actual premier competitive formats, but they have Commander tournament data too, thankfully. So using this website, I have collected slightly over 1,000 top-placing deck lists from the larger CEDH tournaments that have been hosted within the last year, roughly. To be specific, this dataset comes from tournaments between June 1st of 2024 and June 1st of 2025. So as of writing, at least, I updated it at the start of the month, going back to span exactly a year's worth of competitive data. This does mean that some of the cards here will no longer be legal in the format, since there was a banning late last year, and it also means the recent unbans will only have about a month worth of play data to go off of, which is not a lot. To keep this list more results-oriented, I've made sure to, again, only include larger tournaments here, so we're not getting bogged down with local tournament data, and furthermore, we only use data from the highest placing decks in said tournaments. To be specific, again, we take the top 16 decks from the largest tournament category on the site, which all generally have a minimum of 128 players, usually ranging up to 256 players, and we take the top 8 decks from the second largest category of tournaments on MTG decks, which usually have a minimum of 64 players, again ranging up to no more than 128. Some of the higher profile invitational tournaments may also show up here, despite not necessarily having quite as many players, but given the contenders for those tournaments have pretty established competitive performances, the lower player count shouldn't affect the quality of the results. This is a bit of a change from how I did things last time too, since previously I just took the top 32 decks from the largest category, but I figured that this new method would help more accurately showcase more of the meta, while keeping things just as results-oriented as before, ideally, if not more so even. So with those parameters, all we do is compile the deck lists, see how many copies of each card show up across the dataset, and then from there, we create separate tiers based on the play rates. If you want to look at all the tiers individually, each of them is compiled as a Mox Field deck and linked in the description below. The data gets separated into 9 different tiers, with the highest tier being meta-defining staples and generic auto-include cards, and the lowest tier cards having nearly invisible play rates as far as the meta is concerned, so they're less relevant. Starting with Tier 1, we have cards with over a 50% play rate across this dataset, meaning that every card here shows up in at least half of the highest performing decks across these tournaments. Tier 2 contains all cards with an over 20% play rate, excluding the ones already in Tier 1 of course, and Tier 3 is cards with an over 10% play rate. These first 3 tiers are the main meta-defining ones, and I consider each card within these tiers to be a CEDH staple in one way or another, especially considering their particularly high play rates. Moving down from there though, Tier 4 contains all remaining cards with a play rate greater than 5%, and Tier 5 contains cards with a play rate greater than 2.5%. These are generally still fairly powerful cards, but they tend to be a bit more niche in use, either needing a specific archetype or specific commander to function optimally. Tier 6 includes cards with a play rate greater than 1%, and Tier 7 is cards with a play rate above 0.5%. Generally, all of these are still good, functional cards to show up in multiple different top-scoring CEDH decks, of course, but given their small play rates, they tend to be even more specific to the deck. They're usually well outclassed by other cards that you'll find across the higher tiers. And finally, we have Tier 8, which is almost all the remaining cards with a below 0.5% play rate, and then Tier 9, which is all of the cards with a below 0.1% play rate, which means across the entire dataset, the cards in Tier 9 only show up in one deck at most. These two tiers, especially Tier 9, have low enough play rates that even though these cards do show up in a small handful of CEDH decks, some of them might not actually be very efficient, with some potentially even being semi-inefficient pet cards. Tier 9 is mostly here for the sake of completionism, and is more likely to, again, just have pet cards in it, but Tier 8 does at least have some fairly good cards still, since at the very least multiple copies of these cards do show up in the dataset. Once again, these tiers are purely based on play rate as opposed to power, and therefore they're not flawless. Magda is perpetually a good example of this since she runs a lot of cheap dwarves to enable herself easily, but since she is arguably the strongest mono-red commander, you end up seeing a lot of dwarves that do virtually nothing in the, middle tiers of these lists here, just because there are a lot of Magda decks out there. It's important to still understand why the individual cards are being run, and to analyze what they do for your deck in particular before just throwing them in because of their high play rates. Magda Dwarves are one of the more extreme examples of that, since no other CEDH commander will be running them aside from her, most likely. Also, just to put the numbers into perspective, here's the numbers for the Staples page on EDH Rec. The top 100 cards played in decks across that site range from a play rate of 84% down to 13%. The top 200 go from 12% to 8%, the top 300 go from 8% to 6%, and the top 500 go down from 6% to 5%. From there, the remaining top 1,000 range down from 5% to 3%. So, top 100 is kind of basically akin to our first 3 CEDH tiers here, and it, slowly goes down as it goes. The numbers I picked to separate the tiers are arguably a bit arbitrary, but you can kind of compare the scaling from EDH Rec Staples to the tier lists that I've assembled if you want an idea of where those cards land in comparison. Though, of course, there are a lot more decks in EDH Rec's database than in this CEDH dataset, so it's not going to be one-to-one either way. That pretty much fully covers the methodology, though, and I like to think it's a pretty results-oriented system that can help you learn more about the general CEDH meta. I'll try to update these lists again in a few months, and if you want a raw version of the tiers with the exact play rates for each card, there's a link to the original sorted dataset in the video description, which is up as a Google Doc. Even if you're not a CEDH player though, these lists can be pretty handy for deck building, since most Bracket 4 commander decks are going to want to be using CEDH staples for optimization anyways. And of course, you can always look through the mid-tiers and lower tiers here for inspiration in your Bracket 3 and Bracket 2 decks, for instance. But of course, this wouldn't be much of an update video without me actually talking a bit about what actually changed on these tier lists. So let's take a closer look at which cards have moved around since last time. Largely, a lot of them remained in relatively the same places, so I'll only be going over the more major changes, mostly just new additions and changes for the CEDH staple tiers in particular, 1, 2, and 3. So, starting with Tier 1, for the most part, we've thinned it down a little bit. Gamble, Lion's Eye Diamond, Simian Spirit Guide, Red Elemental Blast, Underworld Breach, Mystical Tutor, Cyclonic Rift, Volcanic Island, and finally An Offer You Can't Refuse, all got demoted to Tier 2. On top of that, since Jeweled Lotus, Mana Crypt, and Dockside Extortionist got banned, their play rates have also dropped, and they've been moved down from Tier 1 to Tier 2 as well. We did get one new addition, though. Enlightened Tutor saw enough recent play to sneak up from a Tier 2 staple to a Tier 1 staple. Speaking of Tier 2 staples, we have a few cards that moved out of that tier since last time, too. Displacer Kitten, Teferi Time Raveler, Flesh Duplicate, Mana Drain, Toxic Deluge, Forbidden Orchard, Spire of Industry, Phantasmal Image, Taiga, Morphic Pool, and Dispel have all been moved down in the tiers. We also have a few new additions, aside from the ones that dropped down from Tier 1. Those include Mockingbird, Valley Floodcaller, Into the Floodmaw, Flare of Duplication, Sink into Stupor, the Orith of the Healing House, Talon Gates of Madara, and Fairy Mastermind. And finally, from Tier 3, Flare of Duplication and Talon Gates of Madara upgraded to Tier 2, as already mentioned. Meanwhile, Colossal Sky Turtle, Seagate Restoration, Grafdigger's Cage, Dauntless Dismantler, Paradise Mantle, Imposter Mech, Muddle the Mixture, Tinder Wall, Training Center, March of Swirling Mist, Talisman of Curiosity, Blind Obedience, Mount Doom, Dothy Voidwalker, and Daze have also all moved down tiers. For new additions to Tier 3, we get Entomb, Vexing Bauble, Culling Ritual, Pollywog Prodigy, Shifting Woodland, Professional Facebreaker, Delny, Streetwise Lookout, Undercity Sewers, Skullclamp, Godless Shrine, Copy Artifact, and Enduring Vitality. There are some exciting new cards from recent sets that show up in the lower tiers as well. Voice of Victory, Nature's Rhythm, and Mistrise Village from the recent Tarkir set all made it into Tier 4, so those are seeing a lot of play. The recently unbanned Gifts Ungiven has already made it to Tier 5, despite only being here for like a couple months, though none of the other unbans have seen any successful play as of writing. Bright Glass Gearhulk from the recent Aetherdrift set also made its way to Tier 6, while Transit Mage, Repurposing Bay, Lifecraft Engine, Stock Up, and Frostcliff Siege all made it into Tier 7. Lastly, Diversion Unit, Molt Tender, Redshift Rocketeer Chief, Stadium Headliner, Unstoppable Plan, Burner Rocket, Bleachbone Verge, River Pyre Verge, and Willowrush Verge all made it into Tier 8. I'm not going to cover Tier 9 though, considering how many cards there are, and again, how inconsequential the play rates for that tier are, but there are some cards from the new sets in there too, if you're so inclined to look, I'm sure. Ultimately though, that should be everything. Methodology covered, we got all the new important changes mentioned, and all that's left to do is put these lists to use, I suppose. With the last dataset, I ended up tagging every card by functionality, so that I could figure out average deck building ratios for CEDH decks. I've still got a good deal of the cards in these lists tagged, but given the dataset has more than twice the amount of cards that the last one did, I'll probably need some time to get through them all and make sure everything is tagged correctly. Hopefully, I will update the deck building ratios as well in the future, but it depends on how long the tagging business takes. Either way, thank you so much for watching to the end here. Hopefully these lists come in handy for you, and even if they don't, then hopefully you found it fun or interesting to hear about recent competitive meta shifts. The new Final Fantasy set came out after I finished the dataset update, but let me know in the comments which Final Fantasy cards you think will end up on these CEDH tier lists eventually, since a lot of them seem pretty good. I've heard a lot of buzz about Vivi, so we'll see just how much play she ends up seeing before our next data aggregation in particular. But yeah, overall there seem to be some pretty strong cards from that set. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what new stuff is going to be the scariest, or has been the scariest for you so far. Once again though, thank you very much for watching. I'll be updating this list hopefully a few times a year, so please do consider subscribing if you're interested in keeping up with the competitive meta. Of course, I'll be trying to get some more general discussions and other types of deck building help or data collection and analysis out too, so if you enjoyed this video here, there will be more to come in the future, hopefully soon even. In any case, goodbye for now. Hopefully you all have a lovely day.